Jerusalem now. We're moving right along in Paul's journeys. We're about 25 years this side of the cross as we continue. Paul is about to begin his third missionary journey. And I want you to notice the map now. Look down the corner there and see Jerusalem with a little arrow starting to go upward. And this time we're going to take him right through Phrygia and Galatia and then to Ephesus again. And would you believe that this time he stayed about 3 years? In fact, at Ephesus is where he wrote his first letter to the Corinthians. That letter probably went by ship. I tried to put a few black dashes on the map there to show how much quicker it would have been to send a letter to Ephesus by ship than the long round trip through Macedonia. All right, let's look at some of the letter he wrote. Old manuscripts, yes, but we're finding new discoveries. 1 Corinthians 5, 7, and 8. Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye be a new lump, even as ye are unleavened. What does it mean, ye are unleavened? Well, there was some sin going on in that church, and Paul addressed it. And sin represented by leaven, you see, they got the sinner situation taken care of. But it's also true that if they were keeping unleavened, they would have gotten the leaven out of their homes. But one is actually a symbol of the other, and those who would keep the unleavened bread are reminding themselves that transgression has to go. So he says, purge therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. For even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Praise God for that. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now notice, therefore let us keep the feast. But how? In sincerity and truth. And why? To honor the Christ, our Passover, sacrificed for us. Now, once again, dear friends, if he had said, let us therefore keep, preserve, maintain, be faithful to, act in fitting relationship to the Sabbath, we would have jumped on that with all fours and used it in every evangelism crusade. As an example, what if it should have read, let us keep the seventh-day Sabbath with sincerity and truth, and not with thoughts of malice and wickedness? Wouldn't we be using that? But instead, he encouraged them to have a good attitude toward one another while keeping the Passover. Now, he continues his letter, 1 Corinthians 16, 7, 8. This is kind of an interesting note, too, where he says, quote, for I will not see you now by the way, but I trust to tarry a while with you, if the Lord permit, but I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost. What did he say? He said, I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost. So in conclusion, what he's saying to those who enjoy the statutes is simply, quote, in Corinth, you can keep the Passover without me, as I'm not going to be there in time, but do it right with sincerity and truth. After we have Pentecost here in Ephesus, I'll resume traveling toward you. Acts of the Apostles talks a little about that experience. On page 291, quote, for over 3 years, Ephesus was a center of Paul's work. A flourishing church was raised up here, and from this city the gospel spread throughout the province of Asia, both among Jews and Gentiles. Friends, that's a part of the quote. We'll get to the rest later. But think about it. If the feast had been done away, he had 3 years to get the message across. Actually, to dispense with a feast the Gentiles hadn't been keeping anyway would have been a lot easier thing to teach than the absence of blood, fornication, and idolatry. But there's no such word like that. Here in Ephesus, as in Philippi a little later, he chose to remain until the feast was completed before going on his journey. In other words, with respect to the statutes, at this point in his experience, he's still walking the walk. Now let's look at the rest of the story. The rest of Acts of the Apostles, page 291, quoting, the apostle had now for some time been contemplating another missionary journey. He purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. In harmony with this plan, he sent to Macedonia 2 of them that ministered unto him, Timotheus and Erastus. But feeling that the cause in Ephesus still demanded his presence, he decided to remain until after Pentecost. It's interesting how the Spirit would impress Ellen White to simply write it like it is. And that was beautiful. You see, this is a perfectly logical thing for a statute keeper to do. And it's certainly something we should investigate a little more thoroughly. Now, before leaving Ephesus, Demetrius the image maker caused everything to be totally disastrous in that city for the Apostle Paul. Paul had been preaching against idolatry, and Demetrius was a maker of idols. And so he got others of his same craft to get rid of Paul, because Paul's preaching was destroying their business. In fact, the text is given in Acts chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. So let's read it together. And after the uproar was ceased, Paul called unto him the disciples and embraced them. Doesn't that sound good? Warm fellowship. And departed for to go into Macedonia. And when he had gone over those parts and had given them much exhortation, he came into Greece, and there abode 3 months. Now notice, and when the Jews laid wait for him, as he was about to sail into Syria, he purposed to return through Macedonia. The Gentiles were much more receptive to his message than some of the Jews. But nevertheless, he preached also to the Jews, and he loved his countrymen, and many of them were converted. But these were not, and they turned on him. Let's look at Ephesus. In fact, notice the underlining of Ephesus below that red dot. Look at the route to Greece. A long way. My, that would have been a lot shorter to go by boat, but then he wouldn't have gotten to preach in Macedonia. Now he's in Corinth, and he's having trouble. To stay alive, he had to take the long way around. Notice how he had to go. Sailing certainly would have been a lot shorter if you'll notice those little black dots. Now, Acts of the Apostles by Ellen White, page 389 and 390, tells us about this account. And I'm going to read just a few short paragraphs from that book, because some of us may be facing that same type of persecution. And here it shows us very clearly that when persecution is an area, don't just walk in it boldly and preach truth where you know truth isn't going to be wanted, but circumvent the area and go somewhere else. Now notice the quotation. Having completed his work at Corinth, he determined to sail directly for one of the ports in Palestine. That's what he wanted to do. All the arrangements had been made, and he was about to step on board the ship when he was told of a plot by the Jews to take his life. In the past, these opposers of the faith had been foiled in all their efforts to put the end of the apostles' work. Next quote. The success attending the preaching of the gospel aroused the anger of the Jews anew. From every quarter were coming accounts of the spread of the new doctrine by which Jews were released from the observance of the rites of the ceremonial law, and Gentiles were admitted to be equal privileges with the Jews as children of Abraham. Praise God for that. Paul, in his preaching at Corinth, presented the same arguments which he urged so forcibly in his epistles. His emphatic statement that there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, from Colossians 3:11, was regarded by his enemies as daring blasphemy, and they determined that his voice should be silenced. Oh, can you hear the hate in that? Upon receiving the warning of the plot, Paul decided to go around by way of Macedonia, the long way around by foot or animal, camel, donkey, whatever. His plan to reach Jerusalem in time for the Passover services had to be given up, but he hoped to be there at Pentecost. You know, this is getting more interesting all the time, isn't it? Here's a rather long paragraph. Just let's go through it. Quote, accompanying Paul and Luke were Sopater of Berea and of the Thessalonians Aristarchus and Secundus. and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus, and of Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus.